and welcome to the second installment in the ongoing series documenting the history of Russia. But before we start the video, I'd like to thank all my supporters and subscribers. Your support after I explained my unique situation in the last video was heartwarming, and I do appreciate all the kind words and support, and I hope to get through this soon. Alright, so here we are back in Russia for the second installment in the ongoing series documenting the history of Russia. And what we have here in the first image is clearly an Islamic community. Here we have the crescents affixed on top of these Antiquitech rods here. And obviously, it most likely was not always a mosque. It was most likely not always an Islamic community. It was easily converted or repurposed from a energy station or a temple or a healing center. Clearly, we see some very beautiful construction, but that doesn't mean that this was always the original purpose of this. Regardless, it's a good image. It represents a period in time in Russian culture, in Islamic society in Russia, pre-revolution, obviously, pre-1917. And we see a lot of things that don't necessarily match up with Islamic culture. We see a lot of architecture that does not harken back to the days of where Islam originated in the Middle East. So that leads me to believe that this was not always a mosque. The other thing that's interesting about this photo is that we get to see some clouds instead of a washed out vanilla sky. So that's nice. We get to see some early 20th century clouds. And then here we have another building here in the distance. And then here we see some evidence of possibly strip mining or some other mechanical landscaping. So that's interesting. Overall, a pretty interesting image to start out the video. And then here we have kind of a different approach to construction. Here we have more of an old world, if you will, Orthodox Church. Here with the ornate crosses, possibly having a dual function of an energy source, type of Antiquitech. And then we have a lot of brickwork here. Also a very beautiful building. Also probably had a different purpose before becoming an Orthodox church. Many churches around the world actually were built upon previous temples and sacred sites. So there's that. And then here we have another example of these beautiful white buildings here with the Greco-Roman columns and the triangular configuration. And then the mud, the dirt roads here, juxtaposed here with these seemingly pristine buildings, although most likely centuries and centuries old. And then here we have Antiquitech here, but then the cheap signs, the cars with the wooden wheels, and have kind of just the usual scenes we see here where the people don't match the buildings. You know, very interesting to say the least. Just the duality of the whole thing. And then I included this image, kind of a different scene, but I included this image to show just how harsh things were. So we have this person performing a chore, maybe gathering some water, or off to feed some animals. And everybody had to kind of do what they had to do to survive, just like nowadays. And I suppose it's all relative. Work and struggle and strife. There's nothing alien to these people. The harsh winters, the famines, the scarcity. It really makes you wonder about how tough someone had to be to survive back then. So I just wanted to include that too, because it's important too that we understand these people's struggles just as much as we understand our own. And then here we have another building here, Tech. Some boys standing here. This man here has an object, looks like some type of urn or trophy, some type of fancy milk canister. And then here we have another gentleman who looks like he couldn't quite stand still long enough. This guy in the back here on the carriage. Here we have a shop owner possibly with some dress forms here. We have another ghostly image here. Boots are nice and sharp and in focus though, so that's good. Overall a pretty bleak, but possibly normal scene here. Not a lot of people. One could argue that everybody else was moving so fast that they didn't get captured on the film, but that's another argument. And then here we have the muddy roads, of course, with the fancy buildings. And I think that that's the most telling, is that the roads were so vastly different than the construction of the buildings. We're moving on. And then here we have something that looks like it could have been straight out of San Francisco. We have a floating house. Looks very 1915 World Exposition, World's Fair kind of feel to it. And then of course we have the horse and the cart with the wooden wheels. And this is the most ornate houseboat I've ever seen. Somebody standing there, got windows and everything. It's like a miniature version of what we just saw, but it's floating. Did they build it on the barge? Did they somehow get it onto the barge after building it? What's the purpose? Just another mystery of the old world, I guess. Moving on. And then here we have a building that is very, very similar to the Crystal Palace in London. So we have the glass, the ornate construction, steel, and just thousands and thousands of panes of glass. Thought that was very interesting. Up here we have some type of chimera or manticore statue here, some kind of winged beast. Here we have the coat of arms. We have another statue here with a wheel in his hand, symbolizing something, symbolizing industry or labor perhaps, progress. And then here we have some people here washing the windows perhaps. Still a very interesting image here. Very similar to some of the things that we see in New York and London at the same time. And then here we have a scene with more indigenous looking people, perhaps closer to the original people of the land before what we now know as Russians took over. But what doesn't match, this is the interesting thing, what doesn't match is these columns and another one of these triangular formations that we see more in Greco-Roman or ancient Grecian construction. And then we have a fountain here. Overall, pretty pleasant scene, I suppose, all things considered. Moving on. And here we have the railroad tracks with the mud and the dust and the cheap utility poles that were put in way after this building was built. When we moved to this cheaper, more primitive form of energy, you see, these cheap wooden poles just like we have nowadays, nothing changes sometimes. You see? Doesn't match. Neither does this. This is a jalopy. This is dirty. This is inefficient compared to what we could have had or what we did have before. It's like the buildings were too important, too useful to tear down before the revolution. And these buildings were kept, some of them were kept, some of them weren't, but the electricity is the tell. Why use these cheap wooden poles? Doesn't make any sense. Here we have another Orthodox Church that was possibly used, most likely used, for something else before that. We have these ornate crosses again. We have another structure here that looks absolutely decrepit and ancient. And then we have this here, dwarfing it, not only in size, but in splendor, with all this ornate detail here, with all these columns here. Beautiful. Beautiful, but illogical. And then here we have a nice little train station. Very cute fence here and everything. These guys look like they've never seen a camera before, which is completely understandable. I don't think that they had cameras where these people came from, and that's okay. You know, they're just inheritors. They don't really know too much about what's going on. They're just trying to have a good time, trying to stay out of trouble. Got a little guard tower here. Maybe that's to make sure nobody escapes. Who knows? Lots of bricks. Lots of arches. That's good. Just a cute little train station. And then we have these crappy little rails here. These cheap little rails and this dirt and wood, you know, a little wood fence. You know, everything's alright. Everything's not so bad. Looks pretty clean. Pretty nice. Alright. And then we have a beautiful garden, fountain, statues elevated on very high pedestals. Interesting why there's so many and why they're so high. And then we have a pagoda here. Some women gardening. Looks like a nice day for a vanilla sky. You know, just the usual. And then we have possibly some more people back here. Not too sure. Overall, another pretty nice scene. Very old world, very Roman for some reason in Russia. They like that stuff too. Everybody liked that stuff back then. Everybody in the world liked that stuff. Nobody could build any different at the time. It's impossible. Everything looked exactly the same no matter where you were. What a coincidence. Or not. Maybe it's not a coincidence. See, that's the whole point. And regardless of what you think about Tartaria and mud floods and so on and so forth, because there's been a lot of discussion lately, the past is interesting, regardless of who built it or where it's going, with the narrative and how it constantly changes. The past is interesting, and it will remain interesting, and it will become more and more interesting as time goes on. And we're lucky to have these photographs to study. So, with that said, do your own research, and don't let anyone tell you what's wrong or what's right, because we're at a crossroads here where we have enough information to piece it together and find the missing links. So don't let anybody dissuade you from your own research, because what you believe in your own mind is your freedom, and everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But one thing that's not up for debate is if the past is worth investigating. And of course it is. Moving on, we have a close-up of those statues. And we can see a little bit more of what's going on, a little bit more detail. And we see the Greco-Roman ancient kind of influence here. So that's interesting. And once again, how high they are. And we'll go back to the previous photo just to talk about that. I mean, these things must be about 30 feet high. Very interesting. Very interesting. And then here we have another classic example of an ornate building, and then the horses and the carts, and then these guys just kind of standing around. I don't see a lot of tracks here. You'd think that there'd be more tracks from the wooden wheels, more indentations in the earth, but no. And that's okay. But still, very interesting. Very interesting. And then here we have another example of just two worlds colliding. We have this giant structure back here with a giant spire, antiquitech, primitive transportation here with these cheap train tracks, and then of course the dirt, the mud, all that. Lots of people just hanging around, which is cool. Maybe it was a nice day. And then we got this guy here, he's looking very mysterious. Looks like he's up to something. And then we got these cheap electrical lines here, the cheap poles. We already talked about that though, but here it is again. You know, and then we got these guys here doing this thing, and it just goes on and on. But this could be anywhere USA, but it's not, it's Russia. But it looks like almost anywhere else in the world at the time. Moving on. We have this man kind of just standing out here contemplating the whole thing, existence and all its creation. And I'm going to leave with this photo here of this man just kind of taking it all in. Probably not too different than some of us right now, just thinking, what does it all mean, and where are we going, and what's the meaning, what's the purpose? And there is a higher purpose, but it's up to all of us to figure out what that higher purpose is for us. I know what it is for me. Maybe he did too, when he was sitting out here looking at these ancient buildings, wondering who built them, wondering where it's going. So, with that said, thank you for watching. Goodbye.